Welcome back. This time we're talking about Ghostbusters. And this time I do mean the 2016 reboot starring Melissa McCarthy, Kristen Wiig, Leslie Jones, and Kate McKinnon. And unless you've been living under a rock the last 6 months or so, I'm pretty sure you know about the backlash to the all-female cast, the response to the backlash to the response, and so on and so forth. But all of that aside, what really matters is this movie any good? And to answer that question, in my opinion, you can look at this movie 3 different ways. First, as a reboot to a classic comedy. And in that case, it's an alright movie. There's plenty of homages, lots of cameos, and in some ways they do justice to the whole idea of the Ghostbusters, as was told in the original 1984 movie. But there are a number of ways where it just doesn't quite feel like it's the same movie. And I know it's not, but there are also a number of ways in which the movie just doesn't quite feel right as a fan of the original movie. Second, you could look at this movie as a new Ghostbusters movie that's telling its own story in its own world. And I have to say, this is where the new Ghostbusters succeeds the best. When it's telling its Ghostbusters story and introducing us to these 4 new characters who ultimately become Ghostbusters, that is the best parts of this movie. It's the most interesting, the best fleshed out. And while I'll say it's not a perfect movie, even in this case, it's the most entertaining when it's telling its Ghostbusters story. And thirdly and last, you can look at this as a comedy. And frankly, this is where the movie fails the most. Most succinctly, I can say the new Ghostbusters is a decent Ghostbusters movie and a borderline bad comedy. Much of the humor is either sophomoric or simply just so over the top that it just ripped me out of the movie every time they started trying to go some comedic route. Because it never felt genuine. It felt like a comedy trying really hard to get a laugh. And it really killed a lot of the other aspects when they were building up this Ghostbusters story, when it would just pull me out when it was trying to be funny. A movie like this, even a comedy, when you're dealing with a lot of supernatural, over-the-top, unrealistic things, 4 people coming together and becoming Ghostbusters, the real-world aspects of the movie need to be believable. And in most cases, when the comedy really tried to lay it on thick, it did not feel like I was looking at something in the real world. I felt like I was in a world set in a over-the-top comedy. Now, as I said, the best parts of this movie are the Ghostbusters parts. And I really enjoyed, for the most part, the main cast, and by that I mean the Ghostbusters themselves. Melissa McCarthy, historically looking at her other movies, she has a kind of a typecast type character, which has worked but has honestly worn very thin. In this movie, some of her early scenes are more of that over-the-top, in-your-face comedy, but as we learn more about her character and the story kind of finds its groove, there's a lot less of that, and she's a lot more, I don't want to say tolerable, but it's the better Melissa McCarthy. Kristen Wiig, she kind of plays the straight man in this role, and she does a good job at that. She plays the more, not necessarily Egon character, because there's not really that straight-up comparison to this movie and the original characters, but she does play that role where she's more of a, she's trying to be the professional professor and trying to leave the whole paranormal investigations behind her, at least when we first meet her at the beginning of the movie. Leslie Jones, a lot of what we saw of her in the trailers was her being very loud, very in your face. And like Melissa McCarthy, there are those moments, but for a lot of the movie, she's more, not necessarily laid back, but a little more subdued. And she does find a nice balance between the loud and the not loud. Which leaves us with Kate McKinnon's character, and she frankly is the stereotypical Melissa McCarthy, very loud, very over-the-top character. And frankly, she's the character more often than not that I found quite grating and just not entertaining and not terribly funny at times. And you can tell she's the character that's really trying hard for the laugh. And that's like a lot of other things in this movie. When they try hard for the laugh is when they fail the most. But that being said, again, I like this team dynamic. I like these four actors together. I like these characters. If you watched my review of the original Ghostbusters, one thing I noted was that there's very little backstory given. And there's not a ton of backstory given in this movie, but they do delve into it a little bit more to give a little bit more motivation to these characters, and I enjoyed it. I like these characters, and frankly, if this movie makes enough money and there's a sequel, I'd probably go see it and not feel bad about it, as long as they fix the other problems in this movie. And again, that does not necessarily have to do with the Ghostbusters side. Now at this point, I do want to backtrack a little bit and talk a little bit more about this being a reboot of a very beloved movie, and that being the original 1984 Ghostbusters. I don't want to spend the whole time comparing, but when you're rebooting a beloved movie like this, you know, it begs some comparisons. And where I did find some faults is that, and I enjoyed the cameos, I enjoyed the homages for the most part. Some of them were a little too in your face, and it once again kind of pulled me out of the story they were trying to tell here. But the two things that really kind of bothered me, first off, there's a couple changes, and I don't want to get too much into spoilers. I might do a spoiler video later this weekend, but there's a couple things that just did not quite match up to how things were done in the original movie. And I don't mean like story-wise, I mean sort of how some of the technology works. And it just was sort of like, well, that's not how it was done in the first movie. And it never really got to the point where I had to pull back and go, this isn't working. No, for the most part I could just go, okay, wait. This is a new movie telling a new story, and I was able to just accept it and move on. But there were a few of those moments. Though there's another, and again, I'm probably skating a little bit on the edge of spoilers, but there's an aspect of the original movie, and that's because you have these four guys that are basically going into business. The Ghostbusters was a business. They sort of end up saving the day more out of because they were there and knew what they were doing, and you had this supernatural threat, and they were the only ones qualified. In this case, there's not really the business side of it. They never really become Ghostbusters as far as a business goes. They're almost sort of like a superhero team, and if you just kind of step back and look at how this movie's structured and how things play out, it almost feels like a superhero movie more so than a Ghostbusters movie. And again, they're telling their own story and everything else, but those are the things that, as a fan of the original movies, looking at this as a reboot of that movie that I like, these are the things that I had problems with. But those were pretty much minor compared to the biggest problems I had with this movie, and that is the comedy. The comedy is bad. I mean, and often it's because these jokes are just so outlandish that it rarely feels like I'm watching a movie set in the real world. Like I said before, it feels like I'm in a comedy. Like, I'll use the opening scene, which is this tour guide taking people through this mansion, and there's a history behind it. And there's like 3 or 4 kind of one-liners that he gives that I don't see ever being said in the real world. This felt like a comedy, and not a good one. It's just like, from the first 5 minutes of this movie, I was like, this movie's going to be just as bad as everyone's thinking it's going to be. And I was bracing myself for 2 hours of just sheer bad. And it's not. But there are a number of scenes where it's just, the comedy is just so over the top, it's unrealistic. And the other really bad comedy element of this movie is Chris Hemsworth's character. Now, if you've seen any of the trailers, you know he is the receptionist, basically playing the Janine character of the original movie. And in that movie, Janine was a secretary. She wasn't a bimbo. She wasn't stupid. She actually, for the most part, kept the Ghostbusters in their place. You know, she wasn't afraid to speak her mind. I don't know what they were thinking when they created this character of Kevin, played by Chris Hemsworth. All I can think of is they were trying to make the male equivalent of the worst examples of the dumb blonde secretary that they could find in any movie, and then ramped it up by a factor of 10. Even if you accept it that they're trying to do this reverse gender roles, let's make fun of the dumb guy versus the dumb woman thing, they take it so far. A, it's not funny, because the jokes are just like, they're just bad. And two, once again, it's utterly unrealistic, because they make his character so dumb. I honestly can't believe that he has survived to adulthood, because as dumb as they make him in this movie, I'm pretty sure at some point in time he would have forgotten to eat and he would have starved to death wherever he was living. He's that dumb. I mean, I guess in some level I could be offended as a guy that they made this guy character so dumb. I'm not. I'm offended as a moviegoer that they use such stupid jokes to make him that dumb. It's just bad. And tying in with this, because it's kind of a script issue, but it's not necessarily a story issue, is that, and a lot of it has to do with this comedy, is there's some really awkward tonal shifts in this movie. Because you have some very sophomoric humor, some downright slapstick humor, and then you have a few moments that are kind of, I hate using the word dark, because people tend to take it the wrong way, but there's some scenes that are like, there are a couple of scenes that happen in this movie where I'm like, I don't know if I'm supposed to laugh. I think they want me to laugh. But this isn't something I really should be laughing at. And this is something, I laugh at inappropriate things all the time. This was like things that happen, and there's one scene in particular I'm like, there should be some honest repercussions, even if not like necessarily legal, some emotional repercussions because of a character's actions that led specifically to some things happening that were really bad. And they pretty much just kind of gloss over it, and like 5 seconds later they're off to the next thing. And there's a lot of times where there are things that happen in this movie where there should be some reflection at least, but they're jumping off to the next thing. The pacing is actually a little too fast in cases. It just kind of jumps from scene to scene to scene to scene to scene. So I know I've been all over the place with this review, but let me just say, as I said before, the most succinct review I can give for this movie is that it's a decent Ghostbusters movie and a pretty bad comedy. The result being a passable movie that there's enough to enjoy, but it's not good enough to ignore its problems. So if you were looking forward to this movie, go see it. I'm betting you'll probably enjoy it. If you were thinking this was going to be a very bad Ghostbusters movie, I can tell you it's not. It's actually a pretty decent one. So if you've seen Ghostbusters, please let me know in the comments what you thought of it. As you can tell, I'm of about 3 different minds on this, depending on how you want to approach it. As always, you can subscribe to my channel, check out some other reviews, and until next time, I'll see you at the movies.